In today's episode of Linear Joinery, we're going to be looking at a turned wedge-through tenon. I'll be going through the basics of how to turn parts on the lathe, as well as how to create round-to-round joinery. So I'm going to start with square stock, basically a blank that's been jointed, planed, and cut to length. So the blank that I'm working with here is 1 3/8 by 1 3/8. And that should be enough of an oversized blank to create a turned part that is roughly 1 1/4 inch in diameter. And it's important that the ends are cut square so that we can accurately find our centers. So here I've got the center finding head for a Starrett combination square. And I'm just going to mark out the diagonals. Then I'm going to punch the intersection of those diagonals with an awl. That's a squeaky awl. On the part that's going to house my mortise, I'm going to mark out where that mortise will be. Then I'll check with my combination square from the other side of the blank, just to make sure that I've centered the mortise on the workpiece. I'll mark out where I want the mortise to land on the length of the workpiece, ensuring that I am taking into account the fact that it's an oversized blank, so I'll probably cut it to length after it has been turned. From there, I'll take my mortise piece over to the drill press and drill my mortise. I want to drill my mortise while the piece is still square so that I can accurately locate the center of the piece, because I want my mortise to be centered, but I also want to avoid any a tear out on the back of the cut that's going to occur if I try to drill after the piece has been turned. In this piece in particular, I'm drilling a counterbore mortise, and the primary reason for that is because I want there to be a shoulder on my tenon. With a wedge-through tenon, a shoulder helps to prevent your tenon piece from splitting along the grain line beyond the shoulder, which is prone to occurring when you are assembling your joint and driving your wedge in. For this piece, I'm using a 1 inch diameter Forstner bit for my first cut and a 3/4 inch diameter bit for my second cut, which will go right through my workpiece, giving me a 1/8 inch shoulder. It's important that both these holes, the 1 inch and 3/4 inch hole, are concentric to one another so that when we go to turn our tenon piece, it will fit properly. And there we have it, a counterbore mortise. While we've got these two bits set up in the drill press, I'm also going to drill through a sheet of plywood, and this is to create a template that I can use when I get to the lathe. I'm going to then take that plywood over to the bandsaw and cut through the center line of those two holes. This will be used to properly size my tenon so that it fits exactly to the bit that I've used for my mortise. The final step before mounting my workpiece on the lathe is to cut the corners off of the turning blank. This is done to expedite the initial rough turning on the lathe, and I found that the safest technique to do this is on the bandsaw. So I'll set the bandsaw bed to 45 degrees, and I'll move my rip fence to the right hand side of the blade. The nice thing about this technique is that your workpiece is falling away from the blade and into the fence, so you shouldn't have much problem with your workpiece wandering during the cut. So rip all 4 corners off with this technique, and you should be ready for the lathe. Here I'm going to give a basic tutorial on spindle turning, which is turning a linear blank between 2 center points. To give you an overview of the machine, as we work from left to right, we've got the headstock, which houses the motor and drives this turning blank. Then we've got the banjo, which rides along the bed of the lathe and holds our tool rest. It can be adjusted from side to side and in and out and locked in place. The tool rest is self-explanatory. And then we've got the tailstock with a live center. This rides along the bed and is adjusted and locked to suit our workpiece. Finally, we've got a control panel with an on and off switch, a dial that controls the speed and a dial that controls our direction. For the sake of this tutorial, I'll have the direction spinning forward at all times, but I'll be playing around with the speed quite a bit. Behind the lathe, you'll find a rack that holds all of the turning tools. If this is your first time turning, don't be overwhelmed by the number of tools. For most of my turning work, I focus on 3 or 4 turning tools. From left to right here, we see the roughing gouge, 2 types of scrapers, and finally a parting tool. Behind the lathe, you'll also find a board that houses calipers, mounting plates, and various different tool rests. You'll also find close by a grinder for keeping a sharp edge on your tools. Now we get to the fun part, turning on the lathe. I'm going to mount my turning blank by mounting it between my 2 centers, locating it on the center marks that I've previously marked out. I'm going to turn the hand wheel on the tailstock just until the centers bite into the end grain of my workpiece. Then I'll swing the banjo into place and set my tool rest. So depending on the turning tool that I'm using, I'm going to want to set the tool rest about 1/2 inch to 1/4 inch away from my workpiece. And I want to set the height of my tool rest so that ideally the cutting edge of my turning tool is engaging with the workpiece roughly around the center line of the workpiece. So that looks pretty good to me. I'm going to put my safety glasses on. For greater protection, you could also put a face shield on, which you will find behind the lathe. You'll want to make sure that the master switch is turned on. I'm going to use a roughing gouge to start, which, as the name suggests, will roughly turn my stock to a round form. I'll hit the start button on the control panel. You'll notice that the control panel is on a swinging arm so that you can put it in a spot that is most convenient to you. For the initial roughing out of this part, I'm going to turn the speed down to a fairly low RPM. So I'm going to rest the gouge on the tool rest and slowly introduce it to my workpiece. I'll then move back and forth over the workpiece, slowly removing material and making it round. The technique that I'm using here to steady my tool is an overhand technique. You could also use the thumb of your steadying hand to do that job as well. The more you use the lathe, the more you'll sort of find your own technique. But one of the things you'll notice here is that I'm actually moving my body back and forth rather than moving my hands or arms. I find that I have a much more controlled touch by doing this. By touching my spinning piece, I can get a sense of whether I've removed the flats of my square blank. I've still got a few flat sections remaining in this part, but it's mostly round at this point. So now I'm going to put the roughing gouge aside and I'm going to move to the scraper. Here we have a square nose and a round nose scraper. Similar to a card scraper, this tool cuts with a micro hook that you can't really see but you can feel on the edge of the tool. When changing from one tool to another, you may want to adjust the tool rest so that you're making contact with your turning blank at the optimal point for cutting. The surface quality that I got from my rough and gouge is quite poor, but it's good at removing material quite quickly. The surface quality that I'm going to get from my scraper is going to be much cleaner. So that looks pretty good to me. When turning with a pre-cut mortise, sometimes you can get a little bit of tear out on the bottom side of the hole, but that's something that a little bit of sandpaper can help with. So I'm going to move my banjo and tool rest out of the way and grab me some sandpaper. You'll definitely want to make sure that you've got a proper mask on for this, as there's a lot of fine dust that can be thrown off your workpiece. So I'm just putting light pressure on the sandpaper and moving back and forth over the workpiece as the machine is running. Similar to any kind of sanding, I'm just going to work up through the grits. So I'm starting here with a 120 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to work up to 180. Be mindful of the fact that this type of sanding while the machine is running is actually introducing cross-grain scratches to your workpiece. So it's important to, between grits, turn the lathe off and sand with the grain. As a final step, you can actually use the sawdust that you've created to polish the surface of your workpiece. And that pretty much wraps it up for our mortise piece.